So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. As I've mentioned, we have bios at the door and bios online, so I'll simply say that Tracy O'Neill is our first speaker, and the title of her talk is Overspilling the News, Perceiving the Media Event in the Fiction of Don DeLillo. Please welcome Tracy O'Neill.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody, for coming. All right, so I'm just going to read from my script here. In his book, Conversations with Kennedy, Benjamin C. Bradley, today best known for challenging the federal government over the right to publish the Pentagon Papers, recalls telephoning then-President John F. Kennedy in December 1962. He was distraught over the president's televised interview with 3 networks, which he was afraid represented a threat to print journalism. I always said that when we don't have to go through you bastards, President Kennedy told him, we can really get our story over to the American people. Ostensibly, the Massachusetts Democrat meant that television provided a less mediated communication with the public, and therefore a clearer picture of events, than cooperating with the news gathering performed by journalists who would then reframe information in text. Yet on November 22, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas and CBS went live 10 minutes later at 12:40 Central Time, the result was not a more lucid reconstruction of events. Even many years after the Warren Commission report advanced Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman responsible in Dallas to press acclaim, the question of who killed the president has remained mysterious in popular opinion. In a 2013 Gallup poll, the majority of Americans declared their belief that Kennedy was killed in a conspiracy, and when respondents were asked who was most likely behind the assassination, of 19 choices, the conspiracy list was splintered, with the greatest number of respondents who had an opinion on the matter answering that the perpetrators were organized crime or the U.S. government, each with only 13%. The proliferation of conspiracy theories may indicate a wider agnosticism surrounding media accounts, that, as Sanford Pinsker claims, we no longer believe, as Emerson once did, in the possibility of public events being transmogrified into public poetry. To the question of who or what forecloses the possibility of making public events into public poetry, the answer has typically centered on practitioners of journalism. If the assassin's message is expressed in his fatal medium, the media's message on assassination has been more diffuse. Scholars of media have observed the assassination as operationalized by the press for ends outside the evocation of the event itself. Susan D. Muller identifies the Kennedy saga as the assassination story, through which the American press processes and contextualizes all other assassinations. It has provided a convention for how such a story might be told, a narrative trope of sorts, and it has become a touchstone for assassinations abroad, investing international slangs with relevance, real or imagined, to the American milieu, where it is assumed an audience in the United States will require. Barbie Zelizer interprets the Kennedy slang as a moment at which the American media figure seized on an opportunity to consolidate his role as custodian of cultural memory. She argues journalists have made the assassination story as much a tale about themselves as about the 35th President of the United States. The objectives outlined by Muller and Zelizer may not always align with conveying factual narratives, however. The fiction of Don DeLillo offers an alternative reading of the problems of reporting the news event, one less of an indictment on members of the press that emphasizes challenges of perception in news gathering, as opposed to the interpretation and repackaging of information. In DeLillo's prose, a public-seeking account of reality need not only reconcile with the special interests of interpretive communities or ethnocentrism, but also with the mental state philosophers Terence Horgan and John Teenson have posited, phenomenal intentionality. And this bears serious conceptual consequences on the authority of journalists. In some accounts of perception, mental states of phenomenal character are completely delineated from those of intentional character. This framework would suggest that there is a difference between smelling Axe body spray and believing you are smelling Axe body spray, feeling itchy and thinking that there is an itchy bump on one's elbow from which an insect has recently departed, consciousness and thought. In the intentionality of phenomenology and the phenomenology of intentionality, however, Horgan and Teenson stage an intervention into theories of separatism, arguing instead that putatively phenomenal mental states possess inextricable intentional content that putatively intentional mental states, when conscious, possess inextricable phenomenal content, and that there is a pervasive type of intentionality, phenomenal intentionality, which has intentional content solely by virtue of phenomenology. To motivate their intentionality of phenomenology argument, Horgan and Teenson lean heavily on the notion that phenomenal mental states are experiences of properties of objects in space and time, that is, that phenomenal states are experienced when instantiated. In this way, Horgan and Teenson find some affinities with Michael Tye and Gilbert Harman, who suggest that the only way to attend to our experience is by attending to the objects represented by that experience. Horgan and Teenson's second thesis, that there is a phenomenal character to intentional states, includes a few parts. They assert that there is a phenomenology of intentional content whereby there is a distinct character to holding before one's mind the idea that rabbits have tails versus undetached rabbit parts have tail subsets. The image of parts added together to make the whole is different than that of seeing the whole itself. It is a little like the difference between seeing a cake and seeing a dozen 1/12 cake slices. They further posit that there are different phenomenal characters to intentions, which they refer to as the phenomenology of attitude type. They distinguish between attitudinally separate mental representations about the same or similar things. There is a variation of qualia across attitude types, a sort of range of phenomenal content, not unlike tone, tenor, shade, character. A third part of the argument that Horgan and Teenson give of the phenomenal character of intentional states involves the understanding of language. How one interprets an ambiguous sentence, they assert, will have a corresponding phenomenal quality. There could, for example, be something more painful, a phenomenal state, about one interpretation or another of a set of language. More radically, Horgan and Teenson theorize that there is a form of intentionality that is constitutively determined only by phenomenology, that each specific occurrent intentional state with phenomenal intentional content is constitutively determined by its own distinctive phenomenal character, viz. The what it's like of undergoing that particular attitude type vis-a-vis that particular intentional content. To motivate this claim, they invoke a thought experiment in which there is a phenomenal duplicate of you. If it has the same phenomenal content, they argue, the duplicate will also have identical phenomenal intentional content. In this model, one might experience the phenomenal state of, say, acceptance of a belief, and in the process come to have the intentional experience of accepting a belief. Horgan and Teenson provide the example of a state in which one experiences a particular what it's like of believing a picture is hung crooked on a wall, arguing that by virtue of the phenomenology, one believes that there's a picture hung crooked on the wall, the what it is like constitutes the aboutness, so that the givenness of the truth conditions satisfies the requirements of the intentional state. This phenomenal intentionality manifests plentifully in DeLillo's work, and when it appears in depictions of news events, destabilizes the narrative of journalists' cultural authority. In DeLillo's retelling of the life of Lee Harvey Oswald and the Kennedy assassination, the November day in Dallas is drawn through several points of view, from that of Oswald to unnamed onlookers to Nellie Connolly, wife of Governor John Connolly. What unifies these disparate perspectives is the phenomenal intentionality suffusing their perceptual geographies. These minds cannot always be turned toward the object without phenomenal architecture. Rather, at key moments in the unfolding assassination, for a thought to be something, the characters of DeLillo's work must feel the quality of for their thoughts to be about something. November 22nd is in Libra emphatically framed as a perceptual carnival, teeming with disparate views but converging on a focal point. A mass of citizens collects actively, looks, which is to say they are prepared to perceive. Though through a broad, close third-person point of view, DeLillo conveys that the crowd is moved by a not-quite intelligence that occurs to the collective mass only in its gathering. It is in sensing what it's like to have a reason to converge that the group perceives that it has a reason to gather. Street by street, the crowd began to understand why it was here. The message jumped the open space from one press of bodies to the next. A contagion had brought them here, some mystery of common impulse. Hundreds of thousands come from so many histories and systems of being, come from some experience of the night before, a convergence of dreams to stand together shouting as the Lincoln passed. DeLillo formulates qualia as the message, but it is nevertheless a message prior to language, prior to the propositional structure of words following words and phrases and sentences, whole thoughts. Because of the phenomenal sense, the intentional proposition may unfurl onto the plane of feeling. It is a recognition registered at the moment of its effect. Notably, it is also a perception across consciousness, collective knowledge pools around a feeling unique to the crowd. DeLillo also describes a temporally distant form of phenomenal intentionality, one in which the shock of the sudden only seeds to conscious thought in a moment that jars a person into feeling. In Libra, a woman watching the procession comes to know that she has heard one shot and another at the moment she perceives the second shot as the second. The first has been elided. DeLillo grammatically conveys the phenomenal's instantiation of the intentional through the conjunction and, which gives equal weight to the phenomenal and intentional. She heard a sharp noise like a backfiring car and realized it was the second noise she'd heard. She didn't really hear the first noise until she heard the second. To really hear is for the woman to think she has heard, and the second noise is what suggests the perception of a first noise. It is as though the pathways leading from perception to consciousness have been shot through along with the president. Toward the end of Libra, reporters, disc jockeys, and cameramen cluster in the jail where Lee Harvey Oswald is being held. They chant for Oswald to see him. To perceive him and inscribe their intentional mental content, they believe, will remake meaning in a grief-stricken country, one in which sensation itself has been shattered by the shock of the assassination. Those in the media believe there is absolution in their work, that what they offer is a recuperation of a reality now understood to be gored through or sporadic, riddled with discontinuities. They sensed the incompleteness out there, gaps, spaces, vacant seats, lobbies emptied out, disconnections, dark cities, stopped lives. People were lonely for news. Only news could make them whole again, restore sensation. 300 reporters in a compact space, all pushing to extract a word. With a word, they could begin to grid the world, make an instant surface that people can see and touch together. However, in DeLillo's second novel, in DeLillo's novel, The Word, that intentional unit, does not offer salvation for the failures of perception. The problem is not a lack of news, nor is it fake news. The problem is that human perception has been shown to be centrifugal, throwing outward intentional thought from the phenomenal. Years after the assassination, Nicholas Branch, a CIA analyst, will continue to sit with evidence, but the scraps of paper and photographs, the forensic reports, all of it add up only to theories that gleam like jade idols. And the idolatry of their work is a worship of a God absent this world and quite probably illusory. When he has sent the autopsy photos of Oswald, Branch understands that he is meant to believe in the perceivability of the truth. But if there is one thing years of study has taught him, it is that the truth remains occluded, that there is nothing to understand, no insights to be had from these pictures and statistics. The CIA itself becomes to him a sinister unit, a chorus, prodding him toward a single truth, no matter the contradictions. They are rubbing his face in the blood and gunk. They are mocking him. They are saying, in effect, here, look, these are the true images. This is your history. Here's a blown-out skull for you to ponder. Look, touch. This is the true nature of the event, not your beautiful ambiguities, your museum of contradictory facts. There are no contradictions here. Both the group nature of one instance of phenomenal intentionality and the temporarily removed nature of the other in Libra hint at a possibility problematic for journalistic practitioners that become manifest in the interpretive communities of the intelligence agency and the media. The problem is that phenomenal intentionality suggests that perception is not contingent on factors external to the brain. If phenomenology does not wholly rely on factors outside the brain, but partially on causes and effects of the brain's afferent and efferent neural activity, if it is produced only partially by distal causes and experiences that fire on sensory receptors, the consequence is that empirical evidence itself loses its epistemological weight. In Horgan and Teenson's argument, phenomenal states supervene on intentional states in such a way that narrowly based phenomenological states can enact a robust range of intentional states. These distal causes are, even if indirectly, what they take phenomenology to rely on. In this view, strongly externalist theories of intentionality are fundamentally incorrect because they fail to recognize narrow phenomenal intentionality as a prerequisite for wide content and wide truth conditions. An eyewitness may think he or she perceives an event outside the brain, while the perceptual thought is, in fact, generated in partial independence from the real or actual. The mental content conjured by a perception, false or not, Phenomenal intentionality is a frightening possibility for the media. It means that journalists need heed not only the pitfalls of their interpretive roles, but also the perceptions of their sources, and in some cases, their own first-hand observations, their personal perceptions. It means that fact-checking fails. It means that professional conventions like corroborating facts and privileging certain sources of information as more legitimate are insufficient. There is no practice sufficient to healthy skepticism. Perhaps it is for this reason that Branch's investigation, a sprawling and gap-filled affair, shifts from the photographs of blood and bone to airy non-artifacts. He has sent accounts of dream and years of fictional accounts like that advanced by DeLillo himself. The boundary between fact and fiction has slipped away, only to leave imperfect perceptions. In his seminal work, Deciding What's News, a study of CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, Newsweek, and Time, media sociologist Herbert Gans argues that journalists, like sociologists, make reality judgments, interpretive moves which suggest a number of assumptions about the nature of external reality and the values therein. What DeLillo captures is the failure of reality judgments. If Gans considers journalism an empirical discipline held up by an architecture of assumptions that underlie concepts and methods, and a further set of assumptions which could be tested empirically if journalists had the time, DeLillo finds fault with the empirical method. Where Gans observes the phenomenon of value inclusion, the way in which journalists unconsciously assimilate their values into news judgment, DeLillo questions the possibility not simply that stories meant to be objective are shaped by the values of journalists, but that conscious thought itself apprehends and perceptions which may not be empirically grounded at all. One might criticize the theory of phenomenal intentionality for flattening epistemological grounding, making fake news or conspiracy theories weighted similarly to news reports considered legitimate. Yet DeLillo does not question that truth exists, that facts do. It is instead that he qualifies perception, depicting it as precarious. It perhaps shows some mercy for journalists who are tasked with reiterating what has happened. At the same time, the way in which DeLillo depicts notions of the conspiracy are not so different from the way in which Gans describes the news account. The presence of news judgments underlying media accounts about what is new and abnormal, thus newsworthy, requires a collective consciousness or a process of collective decision-making, both informed by and informing news values. These values provide a sense of coherence, a circumference around the news event, just as, DeLillo writes, all conspiracies are the same taut stories of men who find coherence in some criminal act. In the absence of the solid episteme, perceptual confusion is overwritten with coherent narratives that practitioners of journalism believe to be the bedrock of journalistic authority. Their conspiracy is not one of the left or right, liberal coastal elites, or the alt-right. It is in making sense of a world imperfectly sensed. DeLillo writes towards the end of the book of Nicholas Branch alone in with his research materials, thinking of how characters in the orbit of the assassination have begun to emerge, their logics tangling in their violence. It has begun to seem that the plot towards death may not begin in intentional mental content. It may be conative in impulse, and impulses are inseparable from their motivations. They exist in an imperceptible plane. Branch studies his materials, his archive, and what he knows is that the truth of the world is exhausting. Perhaps to DeLillo it is also exhausted, a form stripped of its function by the problems of perception itself. The writers of history and the journalists will not find truth anyway. Instead, the only knowledge is the power and momentum of mass feelings, and those are not the stuff of the news event. In this interpretation of the work of the journalist or the historian, the writer of nonfiction, is not so different from that of the novelist himself. Like the story told by consciousness that it is conscious of an object or event because an object or event exists in the world, the story of the news event is a fiction formed by the translation of a reality only problematically perceptible to the human mind.
Thank you, Tracy O'Neill. Our next speaker is Randy Laist. The title of his talk is TrumpLillo, American Misshapens. Please welcome Randy Laist.
Hello. Thank you very much, Joe, and everybody else for being here and allowing me to speak with you on this beautiful day. When Joe originally contacted me about showing up here, it was probably maybe a week or two after the election. And so, Trump was on my mind. It was on all of our minds. And so My talk starts off as a tale of two Donalds. Two Donalds. The first one, obviously, that we're all here to talk about today, Donald Richard DeLillo. And the other one that we've talked a lot about in the last year or so, Donald John Trump. So at first glance, don't have a lot in common with each other. One a reclusive, literary type, the other a very, not reclusive, not literary type. And yet, if you, once you start to look into some of the biographical details, there's certain similarities. First of all, obviously, they're both named Donald. Second of all, they're both from outer borough, New York City. They're both born in outer borough, New York City. Donald DeLillo, obviously, in the Bronx in 1936, and Donald Trump in Queens, and 10 years later in 46. And they're both, they both grew up to be New York types, New York characters of one kind or another in their various idioms. Did you know that both had parents born in Italy? Not only, obviously, was Don DeLillo's parents born in Italy and spoke Italian as their first language, but Don DeLillo's father was born in the United States of a German immigrant, but his mother was born in Scotland and grew up speaking Scottish Gaelic. And so that's an interesting thing, that they both have immigrant parents. They both went to Fordham University. Did you know that? How interesting. Don DeLillo was there from 1954 to 58, and Donald Trump was there from 64 to 66. Did they follow the same course of study? I don't know what, if there's some research is yet to be done there. And one more thing in terms of their just biographical facts, and maybe you guys could think of others, but one more thing that occurred to me is at similar conferences to this, I've heard Don DeLillo referred to as the Don, as in like the Don of American letters or whatever. Maybe some of you refer to him that way yourselves. And of course, Donald Trump also went through a period, and I think in the 80s, when he was referring to himself as the Donald. So both of them use that, that definite article to kind of imply that they're more than just a human being. They're kind of an institution. Of course, they both are. Which is why we're here. Not that Don DeLillo himself ever referred to him as the Don. Probably I would doubt it, but it's, I just want to put that out there. So those are some basic biographical similarities that give us pause for thought. But then there are also temperamental similarities, as strange as that might sound. Well, for one thing, they're both builders. They both like to build things. They like to erect monuments. Obviously, Donald Trump does this in a very deliberate and assertive style. Don DeLillo, of course, writes novels. And in particular, I think of Underworld, the monumental, massive novel that is kind of like DeLillo's stamp on American literary history. Don DeLillo's answer to the Trump Tower, or to and I think if you have them side by side, if I had a PowerPoint, I would show you the Underworld. The cover of Underworld with the Twin Towers on it and Don DeLillo's name at the top, and Trump Tower with Trump's name at the top, very similar kind of skyscraper-like edifice that they both are responsible for erecting. They're both innovators. In their various idioms, Don DeLillo, obviously, in his approach to fiction, and Trump in his approach to just about everything. They're both iconoclasts, again, in their own way. They never met a figure of authority that they weren't willing to needle or, subject to all sorts of critiques. They're both provocateurs. And DeLillo, I think maybe in the late phase, we forget how provocative he was, not only with Libra in terms of provoking conservative commentators, but even in his late phase, his approach to the novel, as so many modern readers get frustrated very quickly in a Don DeLillo novel because he needles our own assumptions about what a novel should be all about. And of course, Don DeLillo does the same thing, in his own way. They both are interested in manipulating the public image. Don DeLillo, for a while, had this reputation of kind of using his reclusiveness in a Pynchonian, Salingerian kind of way to, in a Mao Tzu kind of way to increase his mystique. Donald Trump does exactly the opposite. He takes a very maximalist approach to insinuating himself in every corner of the media landscape. But they both have this in common, that they understand that the way they are represented in the media has a significant relationship to their cultural identity. And I would say that they're both intuitive improvisers in terms of DeLillo's approach to the novel. Again, many readers are frustrated by the lack of a clear narrative arc or a predictable pattern or sequence of actions in the novel. And many people observing Donald Trump's presidency would say the same thing, that he kind of leaps from thing to thing without really an overall master strategy. And I think in a way you can think of it, in a way they have kind of similar shape to their respective endeavors. So those are temperamental similarities that they have in common. But I also identify thematic similarities that we can identify between the two of them. Hotels. Of course, Donald Trump built his empire on hotels, but you could also say that Donald DeLillo, even back from Americana, built his empire on hotels, and all of those DeLillo characters who spend hours and hours by themselves alone in rooms watching television, sort of the iconic DeLillo character is out there doing that. Capital, not just in its economic aspects, but in the way that capital is related closely to identity and to perception. The symbolism and ontology of capital are something that I think Donald DeLillo and Donald Trump are both very preoccupied with. Hyperreality, two masterpieces of hyperreality, the lobby of Trump Tower and the collected works of Don DeLillo. They are really have a lot to speak to one another about in that respect. In short, they are both masters of high postmodernism. Again, in their very different idioms and with very, a lot of asterisks about, how different they are in so many ways, but they both reflect and, in a way, advance our own post-1960s sense of dislocation and all of those different kinds of things that are associated with postmodern discourse. So what is Trump? So I asked, this leads us to the question, what is Trump? This is something we've all been asking for the last few months, 100 days. And of course, there's no shortage of explanations. But many of them, to me, are not entirely satisfying. There are political explanations. It has to do with Republicans and Democrats, and Trump's rise to power has something to do with the politics of all that. There are cultural explanations, that has to do with race and gender and that kind of thing. Of course, there's some truth to all of that. There are economic explanations having to do with globalism and people who have been left behind by the economic order of the 21st century. And of course, that is certainly something worth paying attention to. There are even psychological explanations whereby Trump is described as a narcissist, or as he has dementia, or there's different ways of trying to understand Trump's mind from a psychological point of view. And so these are all very conventional kind of ways of understanding Trump, and they all have their value in one way or another. But to me, none of them really satisfy on a deep level. One explanation that I have found somewhat more rewarding, more interesting, is a literary explanation that Trump is a fictional character. A fictional character. So that's interesting. So that made me want to explore that possibility a little bit. Obviously, if Trump is a fictional character, he could only be a character from American fiction, a character from the American novel. And a number of characters from the literary canon of American novels jump to mind when I think about Donald Trump and trying to explain, where have we seen this before, or what is this reminiscent of, or is this completely unprecedented, or is there actually some, history to this? Gatsby is, I think, probably the first one that comes up. This sort of self-made man who's kind of hollow at the center. So the tragic romance of the individual who achieves everything, all of his dreams, and yet ... Willie Stark, probably the most obvious one, the bombastic populist politician from All the King's Men, someone who is very adept at tapping into the passions of his base and rousing violent and excited reaction from his constituents. Howard Rourke, the protagonist of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. I think Paul Ryan would probably be happy to think about Donald Trump as kind of a real-life Howard Rourke, exasperatingly individualistic human being who is able, despite all the odds, to accomplish the impossible. And that's, say what you will about Donald Trump, in one way or another, he's done all that. So there are all these different, and you could probably think of others too. But I would also say that if there's one novelist that I had to point to and say, this is where we're going to get to the root of what Trump is, it's the person that we're all here to talk about today, Don DeLillo. And so I approached this as thinking about, first of all, my first thought was about Don DeLillo characters who remind me of Donald Trump, or who seem to have something to teach us about Donald Trump. And of course, again, Donald DeLillo is in a pretty good situation to understand Donald Trump, since they have so much in common. So the first DeLillo character that I think about in this regard is Eric Packer, the hero of Cosmopolis. And even yesterday, Vince Passaro even noticed in passing certain verbal echoes between the way these two individuals express themselves. Of course, there's the very obvious thing that they're super rich. They live in New York City. They are both existentially connected with a skyscraper that they live in. Eric Packer lives in this, his skyscraper. He looks at it. He thinks of it as kind of an extension of himself. And of course, Trump lives in Trump Tower, which is, seems like almost, deliberately connected. They are both. So Eric Packer and Donald Trump are both bizarrely attuned to invisible patterns in the mass mind. Right, so Eric Packer is able to make his fortune by kind of looking into the data of the stock ticker and being able to perceive somehow the individual, the invisible patterns. Donald Trump has done something very similar in his ability to read the mass mind and play to the, to the electorate that would wind up, electing him to the presidency. Both of them are surrounded by talking heads. This is a common DeLillo situation where you think of like a DeLillo character and their experience through their whole day as people coming up and saying some bizarre theory or some economic idea or some iconoclastic theory about this or that. And the whole novel will be like, like sort of a wave of different people coming in and leaving in some way some impression on that protagonist. And that is, I can't imagine that Donald Trump's day is very different from that. Not only does he watch Fox News a lot with all of its electronic talking heads, but also he has the ear of a number of very, interesting cast of characters who all have their own unique, sometimes bizarre, sometimes outlandish perspectives on how to read the world around them. And Donald Trump is kind of there in the center of that, just like Eric Packer. So those are like some basic things. But then I think when we start to think about like, well, what can DeLillo actually teach us about how can we read Donald Trump as a DeLillo character? Well, the interesting thing about Eric Packer is that he's capable of making his own dark fantasies come true in the sense that there's this Ben 11 character, his assassin, who kind of like gets dreamed up out of the novel almost as if in some kind of Borgesian response to Eric Packer's own death wish. At the same time, you can read the novel the other way, as if it's almost as if Eric Packer is summoned up out of nothingness by Ben 11's own fevered imagination and his own desire to, fulfill his strange fantasies. That these two characters kind of create each other, and I can't help but thinking that, in the same way that Donald Trump is kind of like, creates the presidency as his own dark fantasy, that he's our dark fantasy too, that like, we have kind of dreamed each other, and now we're left in this very strange, unsettled, postmodern situation. And I'll just, this will be an essay at some point for, you guys could, take it and turn it into an essay. I don't know how much detail I'll go into here. But I'd say just this is an example of the kind of thing that maybe like, once we think about Trump as a DeLillo character, we can actually start to ask these kinds of questions. Eric Packer, is Donald Trump, like Eric Packer, motivated by a techno-transcendental death wish? I don't know, possibly, but I'll just leave it up to you guys. So there's Eric Packer, J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover as dramatized in the novel Underworld. Paranoia, thin skin, obsession with celebrity, abstemiousness, all of these things are character traits of Donald J. Trump, and they're also character traits of the J. Edgar Hoover as portrayed in Underworld. And of course, there's a direct line between the historical J. Edgar Hoover and Donald Trump through Roy Cohn. But also another interesting thing that I think about that comes out of the J. Edgar Hoover thing is that J. Edgar Hoover in Underworld has this preoccupation with borders and infiltration that suggests psychosemantic significance, that he's interested in borders and infiltration, not simply as geopolitical ideas, but as phenomenological, existential issues. And I can't help but thinking that when we talk about Donald Trump and building the wall and immigration and all that stuff, that we're really on psychosemantic territory, not geopolitical territory. DeLillo can help us understand this. The Texas Highway Killer. The Texas Highway Killer, also from Underworld. The Texas Highway Killer experiences sort of an ontological tingle of existing within the circuits of the media. You get this kind of like sense of like, oh, well, why does he kill? Well, it has something to do with his desire to appear on television and to talk to his favorite, anchor woman on air while the nation watches. This is a uniquely Trumpian, or not uniquely, but remarkably Trumpian kind of behavior. And of course, you may remember that Trump mentioned that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, and it wouldn't be bad for his base wouldn't turn away from him. And as a DeLillo character, you might even say it would be good for his, because there's no. This is the other lesson about the Texas Highway Killer and Donald Trump. There's no such thing as bad press. It shows up in the news. It's good. It gets you more coverage. You dominate the cycle, and it goes on and on. So those are all particular individual characters that I thought, and again, maybe we could do like a drinking game later where people will like think about other DeLillo characters and Trumpian aspects of their identities. But to me, I think what is most important is that when I think about all of it, I think of Donald Trump, the DeLillo character that most embodies, I think, what we need to know about Donald Trump, or can teach us the most about Donald Trump, is really the prototypical DeLillo character in his essence, his or her, but really mostly his essence. I'm thinking of Jack Gladney from White Noise, Nick Shea from Underworld, David Bell from Americana, Charles Maitland from The Names, and you name it, all those other sort of anonymously named heroes that are the protagonists of DeLillo's novels. Donald Trump is one of them, I think. I'll just put it out there as like a hypothesis. For one thing, one of the things that all of these DeLillo characters have in common is that they style themselves after generic ideas of who they should be. Right? So all these characters are always thinking like, who am I? Not in terms of like what is going on deep in my psychology, but like what kind of genre am I imagining myself in? What kind of representations of individuality am I trying to merge with? And I think you could say obviously the same thing about Donald Trump, that he is motivated by some image of success or an idea of himself that is rooted not so much in his individual identity and past as it is in his vision of what, of how he wants to come across in the media or other media figures that he wants to, be associated with. So there's that thing about the generic self-styling. But then there's also, probably most importantly, I'd say the idea of the individual, which is, I think, a very uniquely DeLillian concept. The individual, this protagonist, this kind of nameless, faceless protagonist of all these novels, is this kind of self-externalized identity, who exists not so much as a classical humanist individual subject, but as a mirror game of voices, media blurts, and self-deception. That when we say what is Trump, we're asking not so much about his psychology or his political beliefs or his ideology, but about this kind of like the surfaces that he's reflecting, or the way that he's acting as a reflecting surface for the other kind of stimuli in his environment. That his personality, like that of a DeLillo character, can be described as a series of disconnected impulses interacting in an ahistorical vacuum. That these DeLillo characters, they kind of make their decisions as they go along based on whatever impulses are motivating them at the time, and ultimately, what is really going on is that the character, the DeLillo character, or possibly I'd say Donald Trump, represents a blankness representing the quintessential American psychosis of the postmodern condition. A blankness representing the quintessential American psychosis of the postmodern condition. And I guess if I had to sum up Don DeLillo's contribution to American sociology and literary conventions, that would be the phrase that I would use to say, like, that's what he gives us. He gives us that representation of the blankness. That's the quintessential essence of American postmodern condition. And I would say the same thing about Donald Trump. I would say that, when we really want to get to know him, we're really getting to know this blankness at our center, at the center of our culture, this sort of like mirror game that's happening. And in the absence of the center, in the absence of this foundation or a center of subjectivity, we get what DeLillo refers to as a wash of echo effects. And again, when I try to think of like, what is it like to be Trump? It's like a wash of echo effects. It's all of this like swishing around in this very kind of strange and disembodied way. And yet, and this is probably the last point about this, but I'd say probably the most important point, is that yet, for all of this, the insubstantial and elusive qualities of these DeLillian protagonists, they have an uncanny ability to elude reason and the idea of precedent, to jump the shark of what we thought was reality, and to make impossible things, Kafkaesque things, Borgesian things, come to pass, at least in the pages of the novel. And I can't help thinking that, so for all these DeLillo characters' confusion and self-doubt and basic absence, they nevertheless have this ability to make changes in their environment, to act as real people, and those changes are changes that we live with, that DeLillo characters live with, that our culture lives with, and now that our ship of state is kind of negotiating. My last slide refers to what I would say is the era that we're living in, the era of unpredicted eclipses. And I have a long quote from 0K, DeLillo's 2016 novel that I won't read word for word, but maybe you will remember, as recent readers of the novel, a particular scene where Jeffrey is wandering around in the Convergence, and he comes across one of many video screens, and this one shows a bunch of runners. And Jeffrey has an insight when he's watching the video. He says, well, you know, if you look closely at the video, I was so stupid for not noticing it before. If you look really closely, you can see that it's all a digital effect. There's no real runners. It's just completely something that was made up in some Hollywood computer just for the purposes of deluding us and you know, entertaining us, or showing us something that is completely unreal. But then, of course, what happens in the novel is that the screen goes up, and the actual runners themselves, the figures from the video, are suddenly running all around Jeffrey and through the halls of the Convergence. And the impossible has come true, that this thing that no one would have believed actually represents reality has suddenly burst out into 3 dimensions and is now suddenly running all over the place. This is, so to me, this is, DeLillo published the novel in early 2016, but to me it seems very relevant for late 2016. Of course, people always say DeLillo, he predicted 9/11 and he can see the future and all these things. And I don't know, if we had to say that DeLillo, give credit to DeLillo for this kind of prescience, we'd say, well, here in 0K, in the 2016 novel, we do get some glimpse of the Trump election and the aftermath and the sort of ontological questions that it leaves us with. Of course, we remember during the campaign, especially during the primaries, Trump, the orange hair, the cartoonish behavior, the outrageous statements. This is obviously just a media game that we're being treated to this spectacle to distract us or to give us something to read about in the paper, some clickbait, whatever it is. But then suddenly it's November 8th and they're running all over the place. They're running rampant, and we're suddenly disabused of our ideas that this is a real. So when I say that Donald Trump is a fictional character, and I say maybe we can understand him better if we think about him in these terms, it's not a total, it's not just a obfuscatory. It's not just a joke or a conceit. In a way, I think this is how we have to understand him, as something fictional that has somehow, through the magic of the postmodern condition, leapt out into 3 dimensions and now consumes our reality, just as happens in so many cases in so many DeLillo novels. And I'd also just make one final point, which is that it seemed to me during the Obama years that maybe DeLillo had reached his peak significance. That maybe in the W years, when hyper-reality and the sort of the postmodern condition and truthiness and all this stuff had been there was really had kind of helped to perpetuate the late 20th century idea of the postmodern condition. In the Obama years, it seemed like, oh, well, now the adults are back in charge, reality is returning back to normal, everything's fine, and we're not in this crazy mirror world anymore. But now Donald Trump is elected, and I think as DeLillo scholars, I would say we're back in business, everybody. We're definitely, we're needed, I think, in a way that maybe we wouldn't be if the election had turned out differently. That Donald J. Trump's success kind of shows that DeLillo is, we still need to read him and understand him and reckon with him. He still has much to teach us. Thank you very much.
Talk about the trauma of perception. Thank you so much, Randy. I have to say that Randy Laist's book on DeLillo called Technology and Postmodern Subjectivity in the Work of Don DeLillo is a fabulous book and a very serious undertaking, and so delighted that Randy agreed to be here today. Thanks so much, Randy. Our next speaker is Olivia Kate Cerrone, and the title of her talk is The Unraveling of America, Don DeLillo in an Age of Post-Truth, Violence, and the Media. Please welcome Olivia Kate Cerrone.
Thank you so much. I want to give a very big thank you to Joe Salvatore for inviting me to speak here today, especially in the company of such brilliant authors and critics, and for organizing this incredible and very necessary conference. For especially in these times now, Don DeLillo's work deserves our full attention and re-examination. Just before I arrived in New York City, a colleague of mine, whom I teach with at a university in Boston, asked me about the theme of this weekend's conference. And after I told him, made the rather snide remark that, well, no one in at least a mainstream capacity reads DeLillo anymore. Upon challenging him on this, his response echoed criticisms that I have encountered from others regarding their own personal sense of alienation from DeLillo's work, particularly due to the seemingly cold, cerebral tone of his narratives, of many of his narratives at least. Because I do, as another panelist earlier had mentioned, I do agree that there is a lot of humor and wit, warm humor and wit that can be found in DeLillo's novels. But it's this sense of alienation that some individuals have felt estranges them from connecting to DeLillo's characters as their sense of humanity becomes lost in the abstraction of the prose. I disagree with this, especially in rereading DeLillo's work under the shadow of the current presidential administration, which has forced a newfound clarity in my own understanding and appreciation of the work, in particular as a fiction writer myself, whose interest primarily lies in examining the ways in which trauma and social oppression remake the individual. While Tom Leclerc's categorization of Don DeLillo's work as system novels is not exactly new, this critical lens remains an essential means of acknowledging the tremendous relevancy of DeLillo's work in our current times, allowing us to better examine those immediate forces at play which continue to fracture American society, particularly in regards to the sense of autonomy and identity of the individual citizen as one's internal life is bent and remade under the larger corporate capitalist culture. The trauma of the individual is manifested through a sense of alienation from the self. As the critic Frederick Jameson remarks in The Prison House of Language, the value of system novels offers us, quote, a world saturated with messages and information, whose intricate commodity network may be seen as the very prototype of a system of signs, the systematized and disembodied nightmare which is our culture today, end quote. This disembodied nightmare of present-day life manifests itself through the distorted formation of characters oppressed by those ideological systems at play. While certainly in DeLillo's work there are various systems that overlap and intersect, it is those systems of deception that remain a constant throughout his work, those that are the most damaging and destructive to the individual. Deception exists in various forms, primarily delivered through the media and the use of violence, the promise of war, to alter the mainstream American consciousness, a consistent assault on the American identity, the American individual, influencing the larger narrative towards specific political imperialistic aims, done so often at the expense of society, its faltering sense of national identity or moral integrity, which remains, of course, at stake. Of his work, Don DeLillo, in a conversation with the BBC, remarked, quote, in my fiction, there seems to be a sense of danger everywhere, of something unraveling. Images mix with reality, they replace reality sometimes. The years have taught us to feel the terrible chill of random violence, senseless murders, crimes of self-publicity. There's a kind of soft, dreamy existential violence that is meant essentially to bolster the faltering self of the gunman. The portrayal of Lee Harvey Oswald, one of the many chilling narrative threads in Libra, traces his gradual formation from a lonely, neglected boy who is consistently uprooted, both physically and psychologically, by his family, to the desperate, unhinged assassin of JFK, and Oswald, whose sense of self is fragmented and betrayed by the very operatives and ideologies that conspire to manipulate and further form his identity. Oswald lives on the edge of selfhood, never truly becoming fully formed or achieving a mature sense of emotional stability. One's sense of alienation in DeLillo's prose clearly reflects a distinct sense of alienation that many of his characters, like Oswald, feel for themselves. From a young age, Oswald has rooted himself in Marxist ideology, sustaining himself on a fixed sense of self and purpose through his own purist interpretations of communism, which later puts him at odds when with the Soviet Russian life he finds for a brief period in Minsk. Unable to access his own sense of self, to extend beyond boyish fantasies and deluded schemes, Oswald strives to strip his perception of the world of its larger complexity, reduce its nuance, and narrow into a fixed extremist views and ideas of people and violence. Like another character in Libra, right-wing extremist Ted Walker, who is lost in his ideals of the so-called real control apparatus, his conspiracy theories, hate, and fear-mongering speeches, which are bent on white nationalism and violence in the name of true patriotism, organized chaos, the bending of information to the will of the state machine, is meant again and again to deceive and to distract. Throughout Libra, an intricate conglomeration of former CIA operatives, anti-Castro, current CIA members, FBI members weave in and out of the book, molding Oswald to their larger agenda, revealing that, quote, we will build theories that gleam like jade idols, intriguing systems of assumption, four-faced, graceful. Secrets build their own networks. We invent a society. Even if the thing that hovers over every secret is betrayal. Sooner or later, the manipulation of language and information betrays itself. Oswald is deceived by various CIA, FBI operatives, along with his own disillusionment and lack of resources that sway him to eventually lose his grip on reality. Almost all of the characters in Libra crave to be part of something greater, some meaningful instrument in the larger formation of history, one given some means of control or power outside of the role of mere consumer. Oswald longs to be more than just a, quote, zero in the system. And yet his failure to enter Cuba is a constant reminder of the ways in which he is, quote, turned down, frozen out. He feels he is living at the center of an emptiness. He wants to sense a structure that includes him, a definition clear enough to specify where he belongs. But the system floats right through him, through everything, even the revolution. Still, the promise of violence propels him forward in desperation. Often he remarks that history means to merge. The purpose of history is to climb out of your own skin. We live forever in history, outside ego and id. Oswald, the ongoing shape-shifting malleability of his fractured identity, one ready to be manipulated and infiltrated, bent toward violence in exchange for some imagined power or identity, reflects the vulnerable malleability of the American mainstream public itself. In the wake of the Kennedy assassination and the Vietnam War, a new uncertainty unfolded in the American psyche, one that took hold, that spread a vulnerability and paranoia over the secret manipulation of history, something they weren't telling us, a truth that could never be quite accessed. The media's use of deception, the constant barrage of images and narratives that we allow to infiltrate us, as another character in Libra, another CIA operative, Larry Paramenter, observes through his wife's obsession with violent news clippings, her increasing addiction to news of violence. Quote, she believed no message she could send a friend was more intimate and telling than a story in the paper about a violent act, because these are the things that tell us how to live. In his book, Dark Ages America, The Final Phase of Empire, the critic Morris Berman reveals the ways in which our ever-growing addiction to the media continues to shape and contort American minds and identities as a, quote, new media supersaturation takes effect, one that has led to the privatization and hence destruction of public space, including perhaps also the free, intimate space of one's own mind, one's own critical thinking abilities, as people become trapped in, quote, mobile bubbles, embedding us in a cocoon of digital information, fostering echo chambers of ideas and political beliefs, further polarizing us in factions of extremist groupthink. Throughout Mao too, various kinds of interpreters, public professionals, and private confidants are assembled, the presence of crowds, the thousands of Moonies and Maoist presence, crowds fixated on various texts such as the Quran and the Bible. The presence of crowds is an important one in Mao too. Such a crowd of voices and ideas are woven throughout the text allowing the novel to become, as the protagonist Bill Gray describes, a, quote, democratic shout, where no one voice holds dominance, and the novel itself absorbs our existential terror. The individual is to some capacity preserved, some nuance retained, something that continues, unfortunately, to become fractured and lost in the America of today. Speaking specifically on this aspect of Mao Tzu, Leclerc himself speaks of the danger of crowds, of groupthink, where, quote, we are not absorbed as crowds are by their master or their own passion. What I think is absorbed in this ambiguous text is the reader's terror of uncertainty. The text is uncertain. The novelist is uncertain. The secret of this text is that there is no secret that will dispel our uncertainty. Perhaps it is that angst of uncertainty, especially in today's times, that allows certain media outlets to both feed and quell this anxiety, guised in the form of entertainment, even the presidency that has taken the shape of reality TV. In the money-driven corporate capitalist culture, business informs the shape of information, propelling news media, technology, politics, even terrorism to entertain us, to constantly thrill this market for the id. There is a compulsory need to be entertained faster and faster. Kennedy's assassination, a major trauma in the American mainstream narrative, was of course again echoed in the degree of trauma with 9/11, creating an even more heightened awareness of the presence of chaos, randomness, paranoia, the ongoing presence of global terrorism, the fear-driven policies and language shaped around violence, steadies the American mainstream narrative, lends itself a larger, perhaps inflated sense of patriotism, a superficial sense of moral righteousness. In discussing his inspiration or his ideas around Mao Tzu, DeLillo himself remarked that the awful genius of terrorism, quote, that is, affects the daily lives. It is the awful genius of terrorism that affects the daily lives of ordinary people. We are all potential victims. We're all class enemies. And this shift in the culture was something I wanted to understand. The image of Mao, the repetition of the image is floating, frees the man steeped in war and violence from the man himself. One cannot also help consider the power, the growing power of the presidential administration, of the current administration, and thinking certainly of things that have been passed, such as the War Powers Act, which was passed not long after September 11th, which authorizes the president to make military strikes at his discretion. It has no end date, and you know, and this passing of a law such as this heralded a major shift of power that essentially allows a president to start a war. Right? This is ongoing manifestation of violence and the promise of war, the constant promise of war that the system catches us, the individual, engages us in. Sociologist Todd Gitlin, in his book Media Unlimited, described that at the root of media is, quote, a unity at work, a torrent of sounds and images, a constant wraparound collage in which we are immersed and that moves at a relentless pace. It is a liquid modernity reduced to a buzz, the buzz of the inconsequential, one that goes faster and faster until heralding its own destruction. The surge of violence around media-led events, however true, creates a kind of frenzy in the ever-malleable mainstream American identity. And Mao Tzu, Bill says that terrorists and gunmen, quote, make raids on human consciousness, what writers used to do. We have given way to terror, to news of terror. News of disaster is the only narrative people need. News is the final addiction. Facebook, Twitter, various news media outlets provide immediate, intense coverage of even relatively minor acts of suspected terrorism, putting us on an ever-heightened alert of threat, ensuring perhaps our addiction, along with the sustainability of those political agendas and policies reliant and sustained through racism and xenophobia. But what forces govern and dictate the influence of the media, essentially the power of influence itself? The intersection of big business and politics, of course, is nothing new, though the lack of transparency and inherent corruption remains an ongoing reality. As one of Libra's CIA operatives reveals, again, Larry Parmenter reveals his work in the government, how his work in the government has led him to, quote, legally incorporate foreign businesses actually financed and controlled by CIA. There was a natural kinship between business and intelligence work. Parmenter himself could not always tell where the agency left off and the corporations began. It was a society he recognized as a better working version of the larger world. These were men who believed history was in their care. One can't help, of course, but consider the lack of transparency surrounding Trump and the possibility of his unethical business interests, the subtle and not so very subtle uses of the government to advertise family-owned products and businesses, or the dealings with billionaires like Sheldon Adelson and Robert Mercer. In undermining democracy with plutocracy, American society is further undermined, fractured, and polarized as the credibility of news outlets and political leaders continues to diminish, favoring lies for the purposes of emboldening racism and violence. The recent removal of Confederate monuments in New Orleans, for example, showcases the violent fallout of disinformation campaigns, which originated as far back as the early 20th century, bent to restore glory to a lost cause, emboldening white nationalism. Before the monument's language was sanitized, the system of deception firmly at work, inviting violence and threats against those whose job it was to remove the structures today. From David Icke's violence-inspiring Pizzagate conspiracy theory to the infiltration of hackers and trolls to the daily accounts of gun violence and acts of terrorism in America and abroad, the media's influence in reporting on violence has gained an addictive quality, of course, as has already been said. And the advent of this continues to manipulate truth as politically charged paranoia serves to manipulate truth and perpetuate certain ideas, perhaps to set certain forces and further violence in motion. In an interview with Rolling Stone, DeLillo remarked that, quote, fiction rescues history from its confusion, providing the balance and rhythm we don't always experience in our daily lives, in our real lives. So the novel, which is within history, can also operate outside it, correcting, clearing up, and perhaps most important of all, finding rhythms and symmetries that we simply don't encounter elsewhere. I see contemporary violence as a kind of sardonic response to the promise of consumer fulfillment in America. I see this desperation against the backdrop of brightly colored packages and products and consumer happiness and every promise that American life makes day by day and minute by minute everywhere we go. It is this sense of hollow consumerism that further perpetuates the sense of alienation and loss of selfhood, of personal power in the face of war, even of a war experienced from a distance. I think of the story Human Moments in World War III from DeLillo's collection, The Angel Esmeralda, which focuses on the trauma of the individual, of the estranged citizen, where this is felt again, examined again, through a deliberate sense of alienation and tone and fear under a government engaged in a perpetual state of war. The narrator, alone on the mission with his co-pilot Volmer, states, quote, that people are not enjoying this war to the same extent that people have always enjoyed and nourished themselves on war as a heightening, a periodic intensity, perhaps an addiction, right? And space, they orbit the Earth from a distance, gathering intelligence, monitoring satellites, with limited things to discuss, the news censored, while World War III rages on in the Earth below. Ironically, quote, the banning of nuclear weapons has made the world safe for war. For as DeLillo reminds us, quote, all wars refer back. Entire operations are named after ancient battles, simpler weapons, what we perceive as conflicts of nobler intent. The Interceptor is called Tomahawk 2. When I sit at the firing panel, I look at a photograph of Volmer, and this is the narrator talking, of course, of Volmer's granddad when he was a young man in sagging khakis and a shallow helmet, standing in a bare field, a rifle strapped to his shoulder. This is a human moment, and it reminds me that war, among other things, is a form of longing. But what are these human moments in the ongoing presence of an ongoing system that perpetuates war? How does one retain their sense of humanity or identity as a citizen whose government is engaged in imperialistic destruction? Upon docking with the command station, the narrator of the story remarks upon American comforts. Even here from outer space, quote, "I feel a homey emotion putting away the colorfully packed goods, a sensation of prosperous well-being, the consumer's solid comfort." The young men are given only limited information about their mission. A mechanical sense of duty ties them to the mission, to the smaller functions, the operation at hand. Information is limited and manipulated. A sense of further deception, of alienation is perceived in the narrative tone. Yet strangely, the men receive strange radio signals from decades ago, snippets of voices that reveal fragments of radio shows, comedy routines, game shows, voices they recognized but have never heard before. Meaning is lost here as they perceive information, sounds and languages remain detached from a larger agenda, once more providing a sense of alienation for both characters and the reader, and a space where violence and language limit the larger nuance and expression of their humanity. Systems of deception rely on a culture steeped in unawareness, anti-intellectualism and fear, a nation populated by sleepwalkers, blind to nuance and the larger complexity of deceit. They depend on the erasure of the individual, one who is alienated from his or herself. American identity is malleable, made vulnerable by the shifting of the media, the seduction of groupthink. Once again, Mao too reminds us of the power of crowds as Lacan describes, quote, "bodies gathering together to become one powerful body, reciting one powerful idea that will let them forget their uncertainty and their individual bodies." We must learn perhaps to live inside uncertainty, to do the real work of individual critical thought against the larger mainstream narrative. DeLillo's work offers a clarity of vision, bringing those systems under a greater light. If the novel is to be a kind of democracy, there remains an opportunity to ask the right questions in navigating unending onslaught of treachery and deceit that continues with seemingly naked abandon from the current administration, resisting the normalization of deception, the forces that would rather us remain passive and silent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olivia Kate Cerrone. That was wonderful. Our final speaker for this panel is John Domini. The title of John's talk is Up the Aisle Through 1,000 Beating Hearts, DeLillo's Reinvention of New York. Please welcome John Domini.
Thanks very much. What a terrific conference. Thanks to everybody. Vince, Passaro, thank you. I think that my argument here is going to stand in contrast to what most of you are saying, which is all about ambiguity, uncertainty, the mirror game that he described. I am talking essentially about a bedrock reality in DeLillo, namely this city of his, though I can't help thinking, when I'm talking about how New York informs his work, I can't help thinking of Vladimir Nabokov's crack about an academic paper on sex and Lolita, rather like scouring Moby Dick, he remarked, for references to aquatic mammals. Still, I'm a native New Yorker, and I couldn't help but notice how much of his career depended on getting out of town. The departure is essential to his debut, Americana, and in End Zone, only Great Jones Street in 1973 lay claim to the city, and the result is his early standout. But he was once more out of here in order to achieve his artistic breakthrough with The Names in 1982. That novel ranks at the top of his catalog for many readers, but it's set far from the 5 boroughs, and the same held true for nearly all the illuminated period that followed. White Noise is vaguely Midwestern. Libra visits the far-flung haunts of Lee Harvey Oswald and his antagonists. And as for Mao too, while everyone recalls the mass wedding in Yankee Stadium, the novel's decisive business takes place upstate or farther afield. In one of the few Manhattan scenes, a mad woman tries to smuggle an animal out of town. Take it outside the city, she says, where it's got a chance to live. The line resonates across all the late 20th century novels until, of course, Underworld in '97, which is shot through with New York material. Now, this text will get a closer look, naturally. We'll get a closer look, naturally, and I want to add that my latest revisit to it, I want to add, years after a rushed first visit, I discovered that I'd overlooked a masterpiece. Also, any reader can see how the novels following Underworld are all distinguished by another sort of departure, a new aesthetic tack. My own shorthand for this new approach is fabulist, and in any case, it leaves critics divided, but all the recent work, unquestionably, has pervasive New York reference, and none more so than Cosmopolis. The 2003 text is, at the least, highly distinctive, its story so direct that it afforded DeLillo his lone taste of Hollywood sugar. If I wanted to likewise simplify Great Jones Street, I'd call it a wry travesty of withdrawal into the lower depths. The protagonist's very name, Bucky Wonderlink, is a joke. When he quits, Bucky Wonderlick, lick as in licks on the guitar. It's a joke. And when he quits rock and roll, he's in for hard knocks, certainly, at the frayed edge of long-time market forces. Quoting here, slowly along Great Jones, signs of commerce became apparent, of shipping and receiving, export packaging, custom tanning. Loves the naming the parts, doesn't he? Custom tanning. This was an old street. Yet this same passage continues. It wasn't a final squalor. Some streets in their decline possess a kind of redemptive tenor. So, down on the Lower East Side, though Bucky endures the deaths of loved ones and the loss of his own voice, the tumble occurs as if in stop time. It's fun to watch. The young DeLillo flourishes his rhetorical gifts with fiendish glee, missing few details of post-atomic, that's his line, post-atomic, his phrase, early 70s Manhattan, and certainly not the bum in the phone booth with his cock out. The spirit recalls the young Jim Jarmusch, who must have had a downtown squat nearby. In the end, Bucky feels uplifted to see, quote, the whole world turning into the most ugly, beautiful street in New York City, end quote. Now, Underworld gives me my title from the capolavoro of its prologue, the 1,000 hearts beating around Cotter Martin as he darts after Thompson's home run ball might well be the multiple plots of a novel that could easily contain both my other texts. I'm not suggesting that the comparison's fair. That's not my point. And more than that, Underworld speaks to DeLillo's entire shelf of books. Pafko at the Wall, for instance, stands in counterpoint to his other famous ballpark opening, the Mooney Wedding of Mao II. Surely these scenes set up a call and response, the first claiming the future belongs to crowds, declaiming that, the second reminding us, hey, so did the past. A reminder that also reverberates back and forth across Underworld, which exists above all as an act of reparition. a metaphor from William Gass discussing Proust, in which the author pays back, the metaphor holds that the author pays back what he owes to the very constraints, social, historical, institutional, that he needed to flee. The home run ball provides the Madeleine, a device essential, especially in New York. This city, claims one line, is a ticking clock. As for the present plot, its tentacles keep curling back to Nick Shea and his attempt to honor what we have, honor what we had, as he tells his former illicit lover, Carla, now also escaped their, quoting here, old loud Bronx spoken through broken teeth. What kept them both down finds many embodiments in the novel. The most threatening, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, turns up in the two most germ-filled of the text's Petri dishes, both microcosms of the city, namely that Giant Dodgers finale and Truman Capote's black and white ball. For yearning types like Carla and Nick, however, another impediment to their getaway may be even more daunting. This isn't a threat either, but rather just the opposite. The deep comforts of the ghetto, the smell of bread baking and sauce on simmer. The skyline of Manhattan itself is described as a Valium sunset, smoky and golden. This Soma, too, can put the truth of their secret love, their secret selves, to sleep. Even Hoover feels a similar tug at him. He wants to feel a compatriot's nearness and affinity. Quote, that's a quote. Amid, quote, all these people formed by language and climate and popular songs and breakfast foods. To make such a connection is a thing of the spirit, ultimately. And so I have to concur with thinkers like the brainy New Yorker, Josephine Hendon, who detects parallels between the Bronx and underworld and St. Augustine's City of God. In DeLillo's great novel, after all, a nun has the final word. Also, this sister has the strange name Edgar, an antipode, no doubt, to the repressive G-Man. And her heroic work in the slum Bronx of the 80s may bring about a greater renewal. Capital burns off the nuance in a culture. Sister Edgar is the one who says this late in the novel, and the insight speaks powerfully for Cosmopolis. Capital burns off the nuance in a culture, and when it comes to Das Kapital and its Das Kapital, it's hard to imagine a more striking exemplar than the young Eric Packer, fabulously wealthy, his stretch limo moving at Inchworm Creep, that's DeLillo, not me, cross town. Eric revels in the burn-off. He complains repeatedly that nuance is now out of date. Even the earbud worn by his head of security is a vestigial device. New York itself seems an outmoded construct, and it's his own limo, no pavement-bound poet that contains multitudes. Within, Eric does all his bidding and forbidding. Most notoriously, he undergoes the rectal probe from his doctor, even as he's consulting with his CSO. Together, he and that woman fall into seductive palaver. A number of you have remarked on this scene. Talk about a coddled odyssey. This airless world has no place for mid-Manhattan's hard sell. Black men wore signboards and spoke in African murmurs, cash for gold and diamonds, rings, coins, pearls, wholesale jewelry, antique jewelry. This was the souk, the shtetl. Here were hagglers and talebearers, the scrapmongers, the dealers in stray talk. The street was an offense to the truth of the future. Yet this very passage then goes on into a telling counterpoint. But he responded to it. He felt it enter every receptor and vault electrically to his brain. This same tension between the city of numbers on the videos and the one of the souk and shtetl is central to whatever joy and power you find in Cosmopolis. The protagonist reigns like a god. Come to think, he moves like the sun, east to west. Yet from the first, he's wrestling with his own weakness, his thoughts as he watches the dawn after a night of insomnia. He didn't know what he wanted. Outside his vast windows, the noblest thing seems a bridge across the river. And for this protagonist, the only bridge he hasn't crossed is the one to ruin. The voyage that matters is the voyage that matters is back to, all right. He wants to be there among them, all body, the tattooed, the hairy ass, those who stank. He wants to see himself in the middle of the intersection among the old with their raised veins and body blotches, and next to the dwarf with the bump on his head. He, in fact, wants to embrace Bucky Wonderlink's A Part of Town. If the novel works, and myself, obviously, I admire it, it works as a fable of renunciation, in which a king systematically strips away his own power in order to know at last, quote, how things persist in the habits of gravity and time. There's the end quote. This, then, is my reading of the three novels that seem to me to have most to do with the author's native city. There's a lot more to say, naturally. For now, I would conclude in pointing out how these three novels all work very much against the grain of their time. Or perhaps I should say they worked against it, past tense, an ambiguity in keeping with the book's recurrent meditation on time, prompted by the layering of the downtown palimpsest. Still, whatever the ruling interpretation of that palimpsest of epochs, whatever the ruling interpretation at the time the books were written, this author worked against it. About 1970, conventional wisdom held that decent white folks could no longer live in New York. My own grandparents fled the village. But DeLillo took an underfed white musician down those same mean streets and there awarded him a strange resurrection. At the end of the 90s, as Giuliani was famously cleaning up the city, handing Times Square into the gloved hands of the folks at Disney, DeLillo chose to meditate at length on the scruffiest, scariest borough. And there he found his own immortal Grecian urn. And over this past decade, as Manhattan seems more and more a playground for the very rich, Cosmopolis reminds us that what the rich and comfortable seek in a complicated nexus like New York is the authority of the real. See, Baudrillard, another, the authority of the real, the humanity within the numbers. Even a naturalized New Yorker like Tom Wolfe would call Eric Packer a master of the universe, but this master needs to go back down to the rag and bone shop of the heart. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit of time. We have a little bit of time left for questions. I apologize for running over. I'm going to ask if folks do have questions, if they could use the microphone over here since we are taping this event. And I'd welcome the panelists as well to ask questions of one another. Is someone approaching the microphone? Good. Hey, Vince, it's our keynote speaker. Yep.
I just wanted to offer to Olivia and also as a kind of epigraph for a lot of this discussion. It was on my mind last night as well. The DeLillo-esque prescience almost of D.H. Lawrence, who came to live in the United States and travel in Mexico in the early, right after, tail end of and after World War I, having had trouble with being married to a German. And while doing that, he did this book called Studies in Classic American Literature, although the idea of classic and American literature sort of couldn't have been further apart at the time. And in there, he's fascinated by someone we hardly read anymore or talk about, which is James Fenimore Cooper and the whole Deerslayer series. And in talking about Natty Bumppo, he said, the essential American soul is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. And more, this quote comes back to me, and I just wanted to offer it here for discussion as well, because, first of all, the DeLillo archetype is so close to that, although not bent on good, not with this flawless moral understanding. But I also thought of it in relation to Andrea's talk last night, because the essential American hero exists outside the law and finds the law a completely unnecessary hindrance to doing good, which, you know, relates to this idea of Americans like not having any understanding of how they're seen in the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, or the rest of the developed, civilized, whatever you want to call it, world, has a different relationship to the law than we do. We see it as kind of a, you know, if you look at any typical American narrative, the law is, you know, something that is in the way of doing what is actually excellent. So I think that DeLillo's characters are very much, you know, imbued with that. And I thought of it again when I was listening to today's remarks. So that's all. It's not a question exactly. Mm-hmm. It's just a sort of throw up. Yeah. It's a beach ball.
Well,
thank you, Vince.
I'll bat it this way, if I may. I would bat it by saying that the DeLillo I love has a tremendous tension there. That the characters in DeLillo, and I just was talking about this with the Underworld, and especially, they miss connection, they seek connection, they cannot get away, and you see it again and again. You know, the marvelous seduction scene and the whole track of the novel and the names. You know, he watches her dance and he remembers There is this great pleasure in knowing another, and he has to find a way to seduce her. That's his own way, but he has to have that comfort. And I could give a bunch of other examples. But I love that line. It's a great poetic line by D.H. Lawrence. It's not entirely true. I mean, a lot of that can be said about a lot of criticism, but to take a novel that every American reads these days, right? To Kill a Mockingbird, I would say the law is absolutely crucial in To Kill a Mockingbird. You observe the law, and you'll at least save this guy for a while. But it does give us a useful yardstick for DeLillo. I would say he's much more complex and social, much more a New Yorker than that. That would be my argument. These guys are not entirely mirror games, forgive me. They remember the smell of pasta, the pleasures of living in a community where you're known, where you knew where to go for a game or for a shot of heroin. That would be my response.
I just want to respond to that. I think that DeLillo characters, like American novels, exist on, there's a wide variety of them, and some DeLillo characters are kind of closer to their nostalgic, origins. Some, I think like Eric Packer and Nick Shea, as you pointed out, but also other characters I think are much more. It's interesting how many literal killers there are in the works of DeLillo. How many DeLillo characters don't really find that much of a chasm between their, kind of alienated lives as consumers or media creatures.
Oswald is seeking community, though.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, you could say, and I think that's a good point about Oswald. But I also think about, Jack Gladney and about Willie Mink and the Texas Highway Killer and all these different characters who sort of in one way or another, play into the D.H. Lawrence quotation pretty well. I don't know, but I think that it's, as you say, it's a really interesting dynamic throughout the works of DeLillo about the how maybe nostalgia maybe pulls some characters at least back from that murderous brink.
I couldn't help but see Lee Harvey Oswald as a tragic figure in a lot of ways. I mean, despite the what he does, what he ends up doing, and I'm not saying that he's a victim at all. But I feel whenever I read DeLillo's novels, I feel that there's a sense of distance, and in that distance that surrounds many of his characters, I feel like there's this sense of longing. That sense of longing is still there, and that incredible disconnect, a longing to be part of a larger system of a community, which is made difficult by these larger systems, but also by language itself. Right? Seems to exist a distance in the use of language, in the use of how characters speak to one another, and the narrative that surrounds the character, that translates the character's story and sense of being on the page for the reader. And I think that there's something there, right? There's something that's being maybe said larger about the ways that we fail to connect as a society.
Yeah. I'd argue that Gladney is very much a creature of law and rules. I mean, he does have this one insight: I can create a Hitler program. But then, he wears the stupid glasses, because I have to do it for my career. I have to look like an academic, He observes the protocol.
Yeah, I don't think Gladney is not a violent character. I think that there are violent characters, throughout DeLillo that emerge from this very American. The other thing about the American sense of the violent character is that he's extremely good at killing. Even if you think about Oswald, think about that shot. I mean, for years I just said, how did this schmagegi, hit him from that distance with a .22 caliber rifle? It just doesn't make sense. Hit him in the head. So, although it seems fairly evident from even DeLillo, who has studied the matter, would agree that that particular bullet did come from Oswald. So, I mean, the priest in that scene in Underworld that we talked about last night, before he gets to forcing Nick Shea to name the parts of the shoe, talks about his regret at not being a more violent human being himself. because he has missed out on some fundamental experience of humanity, and he doesn't understand it, and he feels that, and all of this longing for violence, this actual approval of it, it can be found in the quotes from interviews and in the books themselves. I mean, I think that one of the reasons, I think there are two reasons, really, fundamentally, why people react, comfortable people in particular, people who love their own comfort, react negatively to DeLillo if they're literary people. And one of them is irony, which the comfortable can take in only very small doses. And the other is the violence, is the act, not the violence like, oh man, but the violence like, this is us, and there's no reason to try to escape who we are, you know?
Something that occurred to me while you were talking is just that, I think maybe this false dichotomy between violent behavior and the sort of longing for connection. I think in a lot of DeLillo characters, violence is a form of connecting with other people, maybe the fundamental form, and that's. That's a great example, and of course there are a lot of others too. I mean, I think that maybe that's part of the pathology, is that the authentic longing for connection winds up getting rerouted into these kind of demented patterns of behavior.
Well, I hate to agree with you, but also I would have to say that as much as it pains me, I would have to say that the great sex scene in Cosmopolis is in effect a violent anal rave. So, I mean, if you're into that. Others?
We are.
Way to kill the conversation.
Are there any other comments from the panel?
Matter of 10 minutes, and we got it right.
Yep. Final question, and then we'll take a break until our next panel.
I was struck recently by a news story that was almost directly identical to the Texas highway killing, which was a man videoing himself shooting another driver. And one of the things that struck me about that response was that outrage seemed to be that the video was provided by the gunman directly rather than the news media. So I wonder if you guys would mind discussing that a little bit, how our craving for violence kind of requires like a mom and dad figure to give us the video rather than the killer himself.
Well, that was Olivia's paper.
Go ahead. No, please.
Okay. Well, actually, right before I came in today, I was reading an article about gun violence in America, and this doctor at Temple University, at the hospital there, saying that she wishes that, after, say, Sandy Hook, the images of, the dead children had been distributed, because if people saw the images of gun violence in America, she didn't think that, we would have the same gun laws today. She thought that we would actually pursue gun reform in a serious manner. And so I think maybe the video that you talk about sort of calls that into question to some extent. But there's also, I think, just something that makes people feel pretty upset about the authority of the media being circumvented. And so I don't know if you had something to add about that.
Well, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that what also comes into play is the desensitization. I can't talk today.
Desensitization.
Thank you. To images, right? If we are infiltrated, do we become numb to the images, to the power, the influence? However, if that is, and it's supposed to be in a positive way, right? So that we might become less violent. And I think that authority figures, in terms like you were talking about this parent figure. I mean, I wonder if that's a myth in and of itself. Is that a construct that we're conditioned to have in order to receive that information and be able to make sense of it? But
yeah, I mean, in a way, it asks, okay, what is the role of the fourth estate then, right? Yeah. If essentially that role can be taken over by, murderers or whatever, and that creates a larger question around platforms, technological platforms today, how media is distributed. And certainly, I'm sure very few people are as worried about the proliferation of social media as people in the media. right now. So even you know, some of the deals that have been cut in terms of the embedded news stories on Facebook, you know, it's extremely interesting, but also the business model for media, for newspapers, is, you know, it's changing really, really rapidly, you know, so even since like 2012, this is like a whole new landscape, and I'm sure that these questions are only going to become more complicated.
Isn't what's happened over the media over the last 10 years, isn't it basically defined by a loss of father and mother figures? In particular, you know, there is no Walter Cronkite, there is no David Brinkley. It's now just an endless proliferation of talking heads. Isn't that what's happened in the media isn't that at least a general perception of it?
There certainly continues to be this ongoing lack of credibility, right? Especially when you think about, you know, we have the commander-in-chief, right, who he released a statement, I think this past week, saying, well, you know, the presidency just wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I'm so lonely, and I was having second thoughts, and it's kind of like, well, undermines that sense of authority. And
well, thank you. Let's have a round of applause for our penultimate panel.